The premise of this video is based on a meme, one that I'd seen long ago and not given much thought about. Personally, I think the humor lands, but what I did not expect was how deep the rabbit hole goes for that reference. A few months ago, I realized that if I wanted to read anything on JSTOR, I should do it soon because I was graduating. I don't remember if it was because I saw the meme again or just due to recall, but I thought of this. I had looked up the meme before trying to find context, but found nothing on YouTube and had little luck on Google except for finding the actual 14-page JSTOR document. Up until a month ago, I had the document ready, but never read it. When reading this document, it does a decent job at giving a short briefing of the Disputatio Nova contra Mulieris, a 51-point anonymous essay from northeastern Germany that was published in 1595. However, I'm critical of its interpretation. Simon Gedicus, or Gedik, was a Lutheran theologian at the time who was one of the first to offer a rebuttal to these points. Notably, this document only talks about his rebuttal, or defensio, to the Disputatio with any depth. I also quote from the document, Lutheran preachers denounced the Disputatio accordingly. The author then tries to pin the authorship of the document on Valens Acidulus, who had sent it to the publisher but denied writing it. This document mentions various interesting historical events that occurred because of the Disputatio. For example, when reading this document, it does a decent job at giving a short briefing of the Disputatio Nova contra Mulieris, a 51-point anonymous essay from northeastern Germany that was published in 1595. However, I'm critical of its interpretation. Simon Gedicus, or Gedik, was a Lutheran theologian at the time who was one of the first to offer a rebuttal to these points. Notably, this document only talks about his rebuttal, or defensio, to the Disputatio with any depth. I also quote from the document, Lutheran preachers denounced the Disputatio accordingly. The author then tries to pin the authorship of the document on Valens Acidulus, who had sent it to the publisher but denied writing. This document mentions various interesting historical events that occurred because of the Disputatio. For example, an imprudent student at the University of Cologne tried to repeat the arguments of the Disputatio before an audience of outraged mothers, who were supposed to have beaten him to death with the chairs on which they had been sitting. It also mentions a defensio by a Dutch physician, but fails to elaborate on the significance or reasoning used. The document also mentions how the Italian translation was added to the Catholic Index Librorum Prohibitum, though still proliferated and was debated amongst Catholic clergy in Germany. The document then describes who Valens Acidulus was. At first it is very charitable, but you soon realize that this is merely a facade to push a narrative. The document provides a few possible narratives about Acidulus's death in 1595. One claims he went mad for being theologically ostracized and killed himself. The other narrative presented is that he died in a state of delirium after he converted to the Catholic Church. The author makes a note that his brother denied his conversion, but he received a Catholic funeral after likely dying from illness. The document then gives context about Simon Gedik, referred to as Gedicius, once again being quite charitable in how he is described. The official reason for the 51-point Disputatio was to criticize Socinian heretics in Poland, which were a group of Unitarian Anabaptists. The last point in this essay concedes that if they were Trinitarian, it would be reasonable to assume that women were human. The document mentions how Gedik received criticism from various commentators like Pierre Bayle for missing the point. Though personally, I would side with Gedik on this issue given that the main audience for this was not Socinians. The author proceeds to reveal his bias in favor of Gedik in a paragraph I can summarize simply as simple. He then likens this debate to a dispute between Luther and Johann Kokalus. The author then makes the claim that the Wittenberg Reformation is the reason why Giddich stood up for women instead of anything pragmatic, such as the Disputatio was poorly written and used bad arguments. The author then implies that Lutherans have more intimate marriages and advocates for married clergy, while seemingly advocating for married couples to fall into lust with each other because Luther said they could. After making a poorly based argument on how sexual exclusiveness in academia was caused by widespread celibacy, which Giddich ended because of this, the author claims that this was one of the two great debates in the 16th century, whilst only being a minor episode. Reflecting a major gripe I had with this document, it constantly offers a narrative and then proceeds to completely undermine the narrative it set forth. After reading the most blatant and poorly written Lutheran propaganda I have ever read, I wanted to know more about the author. His name is Manfred P. Flescher. If you look him up, you will find that he's written some books. One such book is, what's this? It's over? The West has fallen. How many must die? I have nothing against Lutherans either, besides the whole heresy thing. My maternal grandmother was a Lutheran, and I'm very fond of her, though she passed years ago. Given how little information I was given on this 14-page document, I was determined to learn more about this subject. And boy did I find what I was looking for. Alongside the original document, you will find a 218-page book written by Clive Hart. I don't like reading much, but this essay was so well written that I read basically the whole thing, except for the Latin bits. The book begins in Chapter 1 by offering context on this type of dispute. On page 22 of the e-document, Clive outlines how Augustine and Aquinas had written in favor of women and the 12th century jurisprudence had written against them in the context of being equal to men. Though even Aquinas would say that women were corporeally inferior. Clive mentions the Aristotelian take and the writings of Gratian Dupont, which do not view women favorably. One excerpt about Dupont reads, "The angels, says Dupont, were, and still are, all masculine. Women's inferiority makes the idea of a female angel unthinkable. When he wishes to condemn women as satanic, this point proves less than helpful. Since the devils in hell are fallen angels, they also are all male." Dupont resorts to sophistry. "Although they have nothing to do with angels, fallen or otherwise, women may appropriately be called diableses, because, like true demons, they are placed on earth to torment and punish men. At best, women are no more than beautiful animals." Clive also mentions of a Calvinist theologian who viewed women as superior to men. There is a lot of information and different points of views given that I won't cover for brevity. Feel free to read the book if you're curious. Chapter 2 is about the historical affair of the Disputatio. It begins by covering accusations of Acidulus's authorship. I find the validity of such claims dubious at best. Clive reveals a letter Acidulus had written to a friend, and that a Lutheran theologian by the name of Aegidius Hunnius had refuted the Disputatio in 1594, before its publication. Clive also mentions that the Latin used in the Disputatio does not match his style of writing. Clive criticizes the Disputatio, saying, "The most notable characteristic of the tract is its intentional and skillful misuse of sources, sometimes quoting accurately, but by omission of the context, or by ignoring counter-statements from elsewhere in the Bible, managing to give wholly the wrong impression. On at least one occasion, a phrase of the disputant's own is silently smuggled into a passage of Scripture. In defense of his arguments, the disputant appeals to a number of well-known authorities, Cicero, Luther, Castilio, and Cornelius Valerius. After revealing a few more shortcomings of the Disputatio, he mentions the response from multiple prominent figures, starting with Getic, which wrote in response to the anonymous author, "The absence of an author's name and silence as to the place of publication reveal," says Getic, "how wicked and miserable are the offspring of Satan." Clive also delivers a healthy amount of criticism towards Getic's Defensio, but acknowledges that he remains more competent than the author of the Disputatio. After a bit more history, Clive reveals a second author who offered a rebuttal to the Disputatio, Sister Arcangela Terabuti, a Venetian nun. Clive is critical of her rebuttal and reveals that one of her future works would also be put on the index. One key point of criticism is due to her focus on combating the author instead of his points. One such reading: "You, to make yourself known as a true devil, act like an ape, imitating the customs of the Samaritans, paying no heed to whether you are speaking well or ill. And you follow the example of the goats who, when one of their numbers runs to the precipice, jump to follow it, without thought. And thus you too follow the herd of heretics, running with all speed to hell, without even noticing. To speak ill of women you try to sow dissension in the most fertile field of the Roman Church, and, besides so many other prodigious heresies issuing from the north, attempt with an impiously pious spirit to insinuate this false dogma into the heart of the faith." Clive also brings to the reader's attention various French translations, one such including an anonymous essay in support of the Disputatio. Chapter 3 begins with some information about the various past translations and then includes his own. He mentions some of the challenges he had and the decisions he had to make when writing this translation. The following are some of the 51 points I've decided to read in full. 18. So that we may counter all types of arguments from our adversaries, we may prove what we are seeking to show even by appeal to grammar. Man, of what gender is the word? For sure, only masculine, and therefore it will be only males who are man, and not females. I know, of course, that ignorant grammarians have taught that homo is of common gender, but they were seriously in error, since they can cite the authority of no writer of worth who ever wrote haec homo. They adduce this passage from Cicero: "Tullia was born man," as if the feminine participle born qualified man, rather than Tullia. If I were to say Tullia was born an animal, would animal for this reason be of the feminine gender? Certainly not. Those learned men who expanded Calpurnius's dictionary noted this, and therefore rejected that authority drawn from Cicero. In his compendium, the most erudite grammarian Cornelius Valerius, who is much used in almost all the schools of today, denied that homo is of common gender, and so also do many others. 21. Those points were fetched from afar. Let me speak of things nearer at hand. The woman of Canaan approaching Christ begged him to free her daughter from a devil. Christ answered her not a word. What, I ask, does that signify? Was Christ too proud? Was he not merciful and mild, bidding all the afflicted to come to him and promising them refreshment? Certainly, by this silence he therefore wanted to signify no more than that he had nothing to do with women, nor women with him. I shall demonstrate it more clearly. The disciples interceded on her behalf, but what did they receive in answer? I am not sent for her, but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Women, do you not hear that Christ was not sent for your sake? Do you men not understand that your wives have nothing to do with the kingdom of heaven? Some answer that Christ attacked the woman of Canaan with harsh words because she was a Gentile. A ludicrous answer indeed. For did not God delight in the whole world and send his only begotten Son as much for the Gentiles as for the Israelites? Let them be ashamed of such crass absurdity. Let them then explain why Christ never spoke to a Gentile man as he did to this silly little woman, given that innumerable Gentile men came to him, asked for help, and received what they sought, not being severely chided, but being treated most lovingly. 34. Eve said, indeed, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it. But in this she spoke falsely. For God did not prohibit the woman, but the man, nor did he prohibit touching, but eating. And hence she ignorantly added, Lest perhaps we die. What need was there of the word of doubt, perhaps? If Eve knew for certain that her eating of the fruit was forbidden by God, and hence the serpent answered, Ye shall not surely die, as if he should say, How is it that thou shouldst die? To whom this instruction was in no way given. And the event itself shows that Eve did not die after she had eaten, since her eyes were not opened until Adam had eaten. Why did God nevertheless punish her? Ask the adversaries. Be not astonished, for he punished the serpent also, who nevertheless neither was subject to the law, nor was man. And in any case, I deny that he did punish her. For how could, in sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, have been a punishment, since God had ordered Eve to bring forth children before she had seen the tree of paradise? Nor is to bring forth in sorrow a punishment, since all irrational creatures, which have never sinned at all, bring forth in sorrow. 47. I indeed know that in the Scriptures examples of baptized women are to be found. But since the Papists baptize bells and temples, are those also therefore to be deemed man? I rather respond that it is wholly contrary to the precept of Christ that women should be baptized. For Christ says, He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He did not say, She that believeth, nor is the pronoun he of common gender, so that it could encompass the feminine. From these things, it is clear that baptism follows in succession to circumcision. How then can they be baptized since women were not circumcised? It is the case that Christ commanded that baptism should be carried out in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, by which formula no woman is reported to have been baptized. Her baptism will therefore be illegitimate. For which reason I add this also. Just as Paul indulgently granted Christians circumcision, which Christ nevertheless did not teach, so also in the earliest days of baptism was granted to women, but mistakenly. Therefore the apostle gave thanks to God that he had not baptized many people, and added that he had not come to baptize, but to preach the gospel. And since judgment is based not on examples, but on the law, examples of baptized women are of no significance whatsoever. 50. Nor do I credit this last evasion of all women. The argument that since all things give birth to things like themselves, it is necessary that woman be man, because she gives birth to man. Now, if this is true, the Anabaptists are lying when they say that Christ is not the true God. If the Father begets a Son, he begets a God like himself. In procreation, when a son is born, the Father begets a being like himself. Nor, in this case, is it appropriate to invoke the mother, who is not the efficient cause of the offspring, who are to be born, but only the instrument. As the natural philosophers say, she adds no form of life to the children that are to be born. Indeed, if a daughter is born that is not like, since she is a defect, while nature always tends towards the best things and prefers to procreate a male rather than a female, as the philosophers attest, this is not surprising, since an ass may be born from a horse and a mule, beetles from dung, lice from fat, the generation of like from like often fails. Chapter 4 includes notes on each of these theses, including summaries of comments and interpretations by Gudic, Tarabuti, Quirlon, Clepis, and others. Before doing so, Clive outlines some information relevant for sourcing and gives reason for not sourcing the claims of the original disputant. He does make the claim that the disputant is likely Protestant, which makes sense if you trust his translation. The following are some responses to the previous excerpts I have read. In response to 18, Sulpicius assumes that the word homo applies equally to men and to women. Gudic bluntly corrects the disputant. In 1672, Franciscus Holtic and Johannes Waltz pointed out that in modern Romance languages, by contrast, the derivatives of homo refer only to males. Cornelius Valerius was a polymath best known for his treatise on grammar and for contributions to polyglot dictionaries. The disputant is mistaken. In his Grammaticum Institutionum Libri, Valerius plainly states the contrary. Homo and Nemo are of common gender. According to St. Gregory of Tours, the matters raised in this thesis had been touched on at the Second Council of Macon in 585. A bishop was said to have questioned whether woman could properly be called a man. In answer, he was referred to some of the arguments later used by Gudic and others, after which he expressed himself content. Tarabuti heretically suggests that God began his creation of humanity without being in full command of the necessary skills and that he needed to learn by experience. She compares his creation of Adam and Eve to a sculptor's progressive mastery of his craft. The portrait of Eve was an improvement over the portrait of Adam. She uses arguments common among defenders of women. They are better than men because Eve was created later than Adam from finer materials, flesh rather than dust, and in a superior environment, Eden. The argument that God progressively improved his creative skills is repeated by Sophia in her Woman's Superior Excellence Over Man in 1743, in which she goes so far as to suggest that some elements of the creative work arose by chance. Man being formed a mere rough draft of that finished creature, woman, God snatched from the lumpish thing the few graces and perfections he found in it, to add them to the many he designed to enrich her with. A few lines later, she partly retracts this comment, treating it as a rhetorical jest, in which she nevertheless manages once again to sneer at men. I am not so weak to think the Creator, in order to make woman the complete being she is, had any need to produce that rude sketch of her man. In response to 21, Tarabuti once more verges on heresy in her eagerness to praise women. She asserts that the true reason for Christ's words is to be found in his statement that he had not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance, as if he meant to let you understand that since woman is just and holy, he had not come to suffer for her. In response to 34, Gudic, because of man or man's guilt, the whole earth is thus accursed, and all creatures groan and give birth with the utmost suffering. Tarabuti's enthusiasm leads her again to the verge of heresy. If God did not award childbirth to woman as a punishment, that is a sign that because of her beauty and other great qualities, he knew her to be worthy of scepters and crowns, not of punishment and pain. Eugenius comments that it is inappropriate to compare the suffering of an irrational animal with that of a woman, a much nobler and sweeter creature. Focusing on biological structures, Clopez pays scant heed to the pains of childbirth. The pain which woman suffers in bearing children is transitionary. It arises from the irritability of the fibers and is common to all female animals, who certainly have not eaten forbidden fruit. The disputant's untestable statement about all irrational creatures seems, in any case, to be untrue. In response to 47, in response to, I indeed know that in the scriptures examples of baptized women are to be found, Geddich cites Acts 8:12. They were baptized, both the men and the women. In response to, nor is the pronoun he of common gender. The disputant argues like a modern feminist, but with opposite intent. In fact, as the disputant will have been well aware, qui is used in Latin as he has long been used in English to refer to any member of a group of mixed gender. In response to baptism follows in succession to circumcision, how then can they be baptized since women were not circumcised? Geddich again shows that he knows nothing of female circumcision. The circumcision of the heart is fitting for both sexes. The circumcision of the flesh was commanded for only one sex, since the other was not capable of it. But baptism is possible for both. Tarabuti repeats her assertion that women were spared circumcision because of their delicacy, adding, and of their merit. She also glosses circumcision with the words, this pain. In response to 50, in response to, the father begets a being like himself, nor in this case is it appropriate to invoke the mother, who is not the efficient cause of the offspring who are to be born, but only the instrument. Geddich, God wants the human species to be socially bound by many ties, namely the ties of generation, of education, of institution, of defense, and of innumerable others. Thus male and female were immediately created in paradise. In response to, as the natural philosophers say, in his De Generatione Animalium, Aristotle had developed at length these ideas about embryology. They were frequently repeated during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Clopez added a sensual clause. The woman only gives in generation the pleasure of physical sensation necessary to man for the propagation of his species. In response to, nature always tends towards the best things and prefers to procreate a male rather than a female. Geddich. Before the fall, the woman was as much of the image of God as was Adam. The fact that woman is now feebler is not to be attributed to the first creation, but to the punishment of sin. In response to, an ass may be born from a horse and a mule. Geddich says that the disputant is himself a third entity, between man and spirit, similar to a hybrid, an unhappy birth of Satan's degenerate being made from some prodigious act of coitus. Unless he repents, Geddich wishes him damned to all eternity. Chapter 5 is in reference to the anonymous essay Courlant included in his French translation. It includes a short summary and then a translation. If you thought the arguments in the Disputatio were bad, I assure you that this was far more painful to read, likely owing to the influence from the Enlightenment, which was the intellectual norm at the time. If the Disputatio felt like reading a Protestant, this felt like I was perusing r/atheism. One thing that isn't strange or anything, but I did find a little humorous, was the essay included objections and answers. Just reminded me of how New Advent has the Summa. The following are a few excerpts from this essay. Their very devotion is rather a weakness than a virtue. It is the product of their imagination, never of their reflection. God has given them an extremely tender brain capable of receiving light impressions. He increased their imagination at the expense of their judgment, because since they were created only to divert, there was no point in their having a deep understanding. Men find that in their fellows, but it was necessary that they have an unbridled spirit, which might often present amusing and changing images. And what is needed for that? Nothing but imagination. But these very charms are the faults in women. From these it comes that extraordinarily things strike them. The truths to which our flesh responds surprise them, and leave them with impressions that are extremely deep, but in which reason plays no part. Thence arises that inequality and monstrous inconsistency in their conduct. Every day one sees them couple the most shameful disorderliness with the practice of the most austere devotion. Second objection. But they will say, how may one preserve the justice of God? Do you make no distinction between a female poisoner and a woman who had spent her whole life in the cloisters? If women have no part in the next world, the crime of one will not be punished. The virtue of the other will never be rewarded. Answer. I am indeed persuaded that women can expect no future in the next world, since it was not made for them, as I have demonstrated. Jesus Christ did not die for women, and since his merits cannot be applied to them, the stain of original sin, of which they are the cause, will never be effaced in them, and they will always feel its sad effects in this life, which cannot be separated from its miseries. This total exclusion from true felicity is the punishment of their actions, which are all evil, because they all begin in concupiscence. It is only in this sense that one can explain this idea in Scripture. Melior est inquietas viri quam melior beneficiis. As there are nevertheless different degrees in their crimes, divine justice will treat them differently. Those who have committed murders, poisonings, etc., will return to this world in a sad and miserable state, and others will return to this world in a happier condition. Hindus be like. For in this world the happiness and the unhappiness of souls does not depend on them. One feels only too well how much the body has dominion over the soul. Many philosophers believe, and I should be inclined to agree, that all souls are equal, and that the differences which we feel among them come only from the configuration of the bodies. If that is the case, it is easy to understand that in putting a given soul in a given body, God can make it happy or unhappy. But let us go further. Let us assume that souls are unequal. Let us imagine one created with the most favorable disposition for enjoying felicity. If God unites it with a badly made body, it grows disturbed, melancholy, or overwhelmed with infirmity and torn apart by cruel pain. If on the contrary he wishes to make it happy, he will give it a healthy body, and it will enjoy the advantages of fortune and all the most lovable and seductive experiences that this world can offer. That is all that divine justice requires. For since woman was made only for this earthly world, her rewards and punishments must all be earthly. Chapter 6 is the original line. There's a preface to the document that is in English, and includes this. The reference is to the German version of Johann Freder's Apologio pro sexu fuemo. In a preface for which he wrote for it, Luther condemns a work by Sebastian Frank entitled, According to Freder, women are naturally evil and are a cause of all sin. They are therefore to be avoided, hated, and fled. The language of Luther's condemnation is quite as violent and scatological as that used by Goethe, and again helps to put polemical rhetoric of the 16th century into perspective. I suppose I include this to show that this probably wasn't a unique situation. Sebastian Frank was a Calvinist. I have a suitable reason to believe that the disputant was Protestant. Despite some agendas, I suppose the real moral of this story is Protestants can't agree on anything. I jest. But I suppose we come to a conclusion of sorts. I guess everything you read on the internet isn't true after all. Even if it's funny, I would not recommend using this argument if you are ever debating a Unitarian. I'm sure there are much better arguments you could use. And these 51 points are full of faults. It's a bit of a shame. This was readily attributed to Acidulus. Overall, I had a good time researching this topic. Check the description if you want to go into more depth. Check the description if you want to go into more depth. Thanks for watching. Please like and share. In response to, this argument is powerful. The edition of 1641 introduces a creative misprint. The printer dropped the R from firmum, making the disputant say that the argument is femum, a comment with which Getic would have warmly agreed, and which foreshadows a celebrated misprint about Queen Victoria's passing over the bridge. Femum or femus means excrement. This argument is crap.